Good morning. It's good to see you here this morning. And our thanks to Tom and the band for leading us in a way that is really appropriate, I think, for the topic we're looking at, worship. We're continuing in that series. Just after breakfast, we just finished breakfast this morning and the phone rang, and I thought, I wonder if that's Mary ringing to say Andy's still in a crumpled heap, bawling his eyes out. He really can't host the service this morning. I promise not to take it out, wind you up anymore, Andy. He's obviously made of sterner stuff than that. So today the passage is just 3 verses actually, but it's amazing what we find in those verses right at the beginning of Psalm 34. Let me just read them through for you to start with. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. My soul will boast in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. Right at the beginning of this psalm, David gets into the thing that's on his heart, extolling God, praising him highly, giving him glory. But then he adds these words, at all times? And that raises a number of questions that I've seen posed by this passage. Can I honestly say that I'm always praising God? Let me give you a trivial example. Last Sunday, straight after the service, we had a quick drink and we left to go away for a few days. We'd got just north of Salisbury and I stopped at some traffic lights. They changed, went to move off, and the electric handbrake, parking brake, wouldn't release. I tried to do it manually, it wouldn't release. And you can imagine what was happening behind with car horns. I never ever do that when I'm in. You can check with no, perhaps you better not check with it. Happily in the end I managed to get it to release and we drove on. And there were 2 things going on in my mind. First of all, I was praying, Lord, just don't let this be a problem. The second thing I was thinking, what are the scenarios? We drive all the way to Stratford and I find a garage that can deal with the problem. What are the chances of that? Or if it's even more serious, we have to get a recovery vehicle and bring the car back and forego the brake. I was praying, but I wasn't doing much praising. But then it did strike me, and it only struck me this morning, that actually the mere fact that in that time of mini crisis, apart from trying to think through the solutions, I was praying, is in and of itself an acknowledgement that God is worth praying to. And that actually is part of our worship, that we acknowledge that we have got a Heavenly Father to whom we can turn in times of crisis. Now, happily, after a few miles, I was able to get off the main road to somewhere quiet, check it and test it, and it all worked fine, and it hasn't failed again since. So it was just an aberration of some sort. Or maybe I did something wrong. The trouble with cars these days is they're far more intelligent than I am, and it quite often tells me it can't let the handbrake off, and I realise the door's not shut, or I haven't plugged the seatbelt in properly. But as far as I'm aware, it wasn't either of those. But it all worked out fine. Then I was praising the Lord. After that, that was easy. And David is doing the same. He is praising the Lord. But he's actually at one of the lowest points of his life at that time. If you remember David's history, he was the youngest son of Jesse. He was the boy that was sent out to look after the sheep. And when Samuel came to anoint the next king to replace Saul, who displeased God, it was David who was anointed. So he'd been anointed to be the future king after Saul. He defeated Goliath, which made him very, very popular with everyone. But as his popularity rose, Paul's dislike and eventual hatred of him rose in equal measure, to the point where Saul eventually tried to take David's life, and David was exiled. And if you look at the heading of the psalm, you'll see it says, "A psalm of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left." The account of that is in 1 Samuel 21, if you want to read it, although there the king is called Achish, not Abimelech, but it's the same incident. It's unclear why David chose to go to that particular king, because they were enemies of Israel anyway. But he was so desperate, he went to try and seek refuge with that king. And it was only when he got there and he overheard conversations of others before he saw the king that he realised that his reputation had gone before him. And he realised he'd walked into a trap, and he was almost certainly going to die if he got into the presence of the king. And so he feigned madness when the king saw him, and the king drove him away. What made the king do that? With one of their arch enemies, one of the warriors of the nation. Wasn't good luck, was it? That was the Lord that saved David. And you notice he doesn't attribute his rescue to his own quick thinking. I was in a mess and I decided I could try this out and it worked. Aren't I brilliant? No, there was none of that. David showed God the honour for rescuing him, even though David had had a hand in it. And it reminded me of a question that I read in my daily reading in Scripture Union's Word Live a few weeks ago. In what or in whom do we ultimately place our faith? Because unless it's God, our faith will ultimately be in vain. It reminded me of someone I know very vaguely, a self-made businessman. He had it all together. He'd got a nice big home, he'd built a swimming pool for the kids in the garden, a nice family, holiday home. You couldn't ask for more. And then he made one bad decision in business and ended up virtually losing it completely. He managed to rescue a few bits from the embers to keep something going and to start rebuilding. Then his health went, and he nearly lost his life. And very sadly, the strain of that, I suspect anyway, the strain of all of that ended his marriage. Up to that point, he was totally self-reliant. He was in control. That's how he ran the business. He was in control. But he suddenly discovered he wasn't in control. And neither are we in control. Ultimately, it's God. And unless we place our faith in God, then our faith will eventually be in vain. David continues in verse 2, extolling God, and he wants others to know, especially anybody going through difficulty, calling them to rejoice with him. And that raised another question. How often do I share with other people to encourage them? How often do I share what God has done for me with other people to encourage them? Or how often do I share on a Sunday morning to encourage other people? And it's so easy for us to say, oh, they won't be interested in that. It's just trivial. Well, my illustration of the car playing up is trivial. But I think it's a great encouragement to know that even under those circumstances, we can turn to God And I didn't stop and put my hands together and close my eyes because I was still driving. I was just praying quietly for God to intervene. You'd be surprised how much you can encourage other people if you share what God's done for you. And David goes on again in verse 3. Glorify the Lord, give him the praise, the honour, acknowledge him as the one who has rescued me, nobody else. And I was reminded of something else I read in my quiet time a few weeks ago. It said our worship and obedience are not bargaining tools to gain more blessings. It's so easy, isn't it? And I know just as well, I hold my hand up. It's so easy to say, look, God, I'll do this if you do that. But we can't bargain with God like that. My worship is not a tool to get more blessing. It's an appropriate and necessary response to the life and the love and the salvation that we've already received. Now actually, I take a little bit of issue with the statement because I want to take it back a further step and say, no, God is God the Creator. And as we sang right at the beginning of our time this morning, he is holy. And for that reason and no other, he deserves our worship. Irrespective of what else he's done, he deserves my worship, our worship, because God is God and he is holy. And then add on to that the fact that he's a gracious, loving, caring God who actually emptied heaven to save me. Because when he gave his son, he had nothing left to give. He gave everything to bring me back to him as I trust in his son, in what Jesus did on the cross, and as I put my faith in him. Even when life's tough, even when life is really tough. And David goes on, exalt the Lord together. Let us exalt the Lord together. And there's something special when God's people come together to worship him. We can worship on our own. That's perfectly true. And we should. You know, it shouldn't be compartmentalized. Oh, I can have a time of worship first thing in the morning, then I'll get on with the work during the day, and I might have another time of worship in the evening. No, that is not how we're supposed to live. Worship should begin when I wake up, and it should end when I go to sleep. Because the whole of my life should be worship. Whatever I'm doing should be worship. And this is a truth that's come out in the previous two talks on this topic. The whole of my life should be an act of worship. But when we come together like this on a Sunday, then that's a very special time. And of course, if we absent ourselves, then not only are we losing out, but the whole church loses out because I'm not there. Now let me clarify that. There are Sundays when we genuinely can't be here. Adam and Sarah aren't here today. That's a very genuine reason. And that happens to all of us from time to time. We genuinely can't be there for whatever reason it is. But equally, in my experience, if I start finding an excuse not to go on Sunday, it's not long before the excuses start finding me. And something crops up every week. Oh, yeah, I'll give it another miss. Yeah, okay, I can't make it. I'll give it another miss. And it's very easy to get into that habit of absenting myself without realising that what it is really is the devil working, trying to rob me and to rob the rest of the church of blessing. Because, you see, worship, it struck me as a bit like a fellowship meal. Now, you have to think back to pre-COVID, because at the minute it's not easy to do a fellowship meal in the way that we did. The way we used to have fellowship meals is that everybody would bring something and contribute to the food. And we'd all sit together and we'd eat together and we'd share what everybody had brought. And that's the same with worship. And the key principles are we all come as often as possible. We all bring something. In other words, we all come with a willingness to worship and to make a contribution publicly if God prompts us to do so. You know, as I think it was Kurt who said a few weeks ago, his mind was still sat in his chair, stood by his chair. His legs brought him out to the front. And if you find that happening to you, then you can be pretty sure it's God bringing you out to share something. And we need to do that, but not out of a sense of duty. Oh, I'm expected to do that. I must do. No, this comes from the heart. It comes from our worship of God. And of course, as we exalt his name, we humble ourselves. And that was implicit in the words of the second song that we sang. We humble ourselves before God as we make much of him. I was reminded of the parable that Jesus told in Luke 18 about the tax collector and the Pharisee that went to the temple to pray. And the Pharisee stood there, something like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, certainly that tax collector down there. And the tax collector simply bowed to the ground and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said, I tell you, it was that man that went away justified, because he humbled himself before a God who is holy, as must we. I was talking to Andy after he opened this series a couple of weeks ago, and we agreed, and I think Andy had mentioned this in his talk, ultimately this is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of my heart. How I feel about God determines how often I will engage in worship. If my heart is right before God, then the rest should follow. And I'll be open to him leading me. And then one final thought, which I think was quite significant as I read through the chapter in the book that we're following. All of creation worships God. Everything that God has made brings him honour and glory. You remember in Genesis, at the end of every day, God said, it's good. It's good. All of creation worships God. And it's easy to see that if you look at a rose flower, the perfection of the rose, or as you listen to birdsong, or as you stand on mountains and look at the grandeur around you, or by the sea and maybe watch a storm over the sea. All of that demonstrates God's awesome power and might and his worthiness. But you and I are unique, because no other part of creation can do what you and I can do, and that is to give voice to our praise. Only you and I can articulate the goodness, the greatness, the love, the grace, and the mercy of God. The first commandment in the Old Testament says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. And as we apply that commandment to our lives, we are beginning to worship. And that's what we're going to do now. And he's going to lead us in communion. And that surely must be a pinnacle of our worship when we think of what the communion represents. Thanks, Andy.
Great, thank you,